Yeah, sure. Hi, Mark. That's right. Good to see you. Nice to see you again. Yeah, well, we've got that time, yeah. Yeah, we all did. Yeah, we got all that. Yeah, it's all good. Yes, I guess she is, right? Yeah, but I'll follow up with her before we get to some of the summer break.
And I'm one of the directors on the board of directors for the Gatineau Valley Historical Society. At the GVHS table, there are many books, including Gale of Gatineau, volume 45, that people can purchase, and also there's memberships. I wanted to just let you know about a couple of upcoming GVHS events. There's a powwow in Zibi on June 1st. So Louise Schwartz, our Director of Publications, is working with a representative of the Historical Society of Ottawa regarding the potential of both organizations sponsoring the bus this year. And it's also a special year for the Gatineau Valley Historical Society. It'll be the launch of the 50th volume of Up the Gatineau. That will take place on June 15th at Fairburn House in Wakefield.
This evening's talk will be recorded and it'll be posted on the GVS Facebook page in the coming days. At this time, I'm going to read the land acknowledgement to honor the Indigenous people who have lived and worked on this land historically and presently. We pay respect to the Anishinaabe Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing sacred relationship with this territory, which is unceded. The ancestral territory along the Tinagadino-Zibi, or Gatineau River, has served as a travel route, location for villages, site of meetings and exchanges amongst visiting nations. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers and the courageous leaders, past, present, and future. We pledge to honor and respect the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I now call upon Gilbert White Duck, Algonquin Anishinaabe from Kitigan-Zibi and president of the Gatineau Valley Historical Society, to come forward and address us.
Quay Kakina, Gilbert Wyduck in Ishikaz, Kitigan Zibi Niton Jaba. Bindigin, welcome. Welcome to this evening. I'm really pleased that we've had a great turnout this evening for what I term to be the event of the year for us. It really is. I mean, we hold a lot of wonderful events, and this is kind of the cherry on top of everything else that we've done this year. And I need, from the get-go, to say thank you to Della Lashardi for our wonderful, wonderful work in coordinating all of this. And of course, we've all gathered with tremendous interest and with a purpose this evening to hear Ambassador McKee, who agreed to come and make a presentation to us tonight. He's accompanied with his secretary, Elizabeth O'Higgins. Thank you for making the trek. You were telling me there was a lot of traffic, and I heard it on CBC where it was Tuesday traffic day or something was happening, but certainly you made it, and you made it in good time, so thank you. I just want to introduce the ambassador a little bit to you, and then we'll get on to invite him to come up to make a presentation. And I do want to say that I did have the opportunity to chat with the ambassador for about an hour over Zoom, which I enjoyed a whole lot. And then he sent me a whole bunch of articles, which in regards to Indigenous people and what happened during the famine. And I love, thank you very much for that. I had never read that before. I kind of was aware, but not to the extent of what was contained in those articles. So, miigwech. Ambassador McKee graduated from the University College Dublin with a degree in history in modern Irish and economics in 1982, followed by a Ph.D. from the National University of Ireland in 1987 for a thesis on Irish economic policy, 1939 to 1952. Ambassador McKee joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1986 and worked in Anglo-Irish Division, which would become the focus for his work for the following 20 years, including for 6 years at the Embassy in Washington from 1990 to 1996. He served twice more in Anglo-Irish Division, focused on security issues, including Bloody Sunday, contentious parades, policing and confidence in the rule of law, the use of lethal force, the Cory process, and criminal justice reform. Ambassador McKee was a member of the Irish government's talks team that negotiated the Good Friday Agreement and was later involved in its implementation on the policing and justice agenda. After working as Director for Humanitarian Relief and UN Director, he founded the Conflict Resolution Unit at the department. He served as Ambassador to Seoul 2009 to 2013 and Israel from 2013 to 2015. He took up duty as Director General, Trade and Promotion Division in August 2015, where he led on the development of Team Ireland and on Ireland at Expo Dubai. Today, he serves as Ireland's ambassador to Canada, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. He writes on a regular basis on his blog, and I would encourage you to have a look at that. There's some very, very interesting pieces on there. So welcome, Ambassador, and I pass it on to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Gilbert. Thank you. Great to see you all here, and thank you, Gilbert. And I learned a lot from our conversation as well. And it's my posting here has been genuinely one of learning an awful lot, because I didn't know much about Canada, and came to Ottawa thinking there wasn't much Irish here, and then started to slowly find out just how Irish it is in the Ottawa and then Gatineau valleys. So it's been a real pleasure to come up here and feel such an Irish community up here. And so myself and Lisa has been great as well, organising this as well. Big round of applause for Lisa Kelly. She's done a lot too. And of course, Della for helping organise this. And I love any kind of local history society, because I'm one of them. I just love the history, and because of my background, I'm very interested in history, and so try to piece this together, because the one thing I did discover was that the Irish have been coming here for arguably for 500 years, but when they did, they set up communities all over the place. And all of these communities held on to their Irish heritage, but there wasn't a big picture. And what I've been trying to do over the last 4 years is put together something of that big picture. Well, how was it that the Irish were coming here for 500 years? And we often say it's because of emigration, but emigration is not really it. Emigration is a subset. This is about transatlantic colonialism. It is about one colony, which is Ireland, helping recreate another colony. It's about the Irish involved in empire and settlement. And that's just the reality. You can't second guess this. This just happens to be the reality. But I think the best thing to do is to kind of look at more local stories. And am I just hit the space bar, okay. So, and because Gilbert is here, I did have a look at this presentation and not only made a local story, but we did want to acknowledge the Anishinaabe territory, which you can see here is absolutely enormous. It goes from Ottawa and the St. Lawrence Valley right up to the Great Lakes. Absolutely massive territory before, of course, the Europeans came. And from the Gatineau Valley Historical Society, it explains the size of the area and the number of different bands and nations that were part of it. And their lifestyle, which was to go down to the fertile valleys in Ottawa to farm there, but then in the winters to come basically up here to hunt. So it was a very, very mobile population at one level and then very settled in its patterns in another area. So, according to the Canadian Encyclopedia, Gatineau is located on the unceded territory. And I've got to know Claudette Commanda, who's another Anishinaabe elder, and she told me her father always said to her, don't say unceded, say unsurrendered territory. Because that's a key part, that this area, this whole territory around here was never the subject of a negotiation or of a treaty. It was genuinely unsurrendered. But one of the reasons why this happened was because the indigenous population had suffered so much from European diseases. And that decimated the local population, so they became quite weak. And we can see that in the history here. This is the dispossession, of course. So you don't really have a huge European presence in this territory during the 17th and 18th centuries. It only really starts coming in at the end in the 1790s. You start getting settlers coming up from Vermont and from New England coming into the St. Lawrence and up the Ottawa Valley and kind of coming in here as well. Not really into the Gatineau, but certainly in the Ottawa Valley you have them coming along. And so when you have the dispossession of the Algonquin, they're dispossessed of the big chunk of their territory, which is the Ottawa Valley. And when they eventually are settled up here, this is what the land they would have hunted in, not farmed or settled in at all. And that's to be borne in mind as well. So at the moment we have, there are legal cases for the land underneath the Supreme Court in Ottawa and for the land under Parliament Hill. Now this is going to be, it's a tough legal case in a sense, because very often a legal case in a very small defined area is actually legally more difficult to prove. But it goes back to that point that this territory has not been surrendered. It also is, when you think about it, you've got the Rideau rivers, you've got the Gatineau River, you've got the Ottawa River, and you've got a promontory. That meant that this place was always, Ottawa was always a meeting place, a place to trade, a seasonal place where the different bands and nations would get together, meet up, trade, intermarry, and then disperse again. So Ottawa was always this meeting place because of the three rivers are being there. So again, that's from Chief Jean Guy White Duck, Gatineau, where they, again, just making that point about where they lived and why they wouldn't have chosen Kitigan-Zibi to be a permanent home. So it's kind of foot to milieu, as it were. So again, Chief Constant, I'm never sure how to say his name. Is it Pinesey or Pinesey? But he was the last great leader from around where Ottawa is at the moment and the Rideau River, a very extensive area. He was very loyal. He fought in the War of 1812, and he submitted 20 applications to the authorities saying, people are moving into my land and I can't do anything about it. But because his people had been decimated by typhus and cholera and those kind of diseases, his community just shrank down to negligible levels. negligible from the settler point of view. And of course, he and his wife then died in 1834, and then the issue was gone. The issue was gone. Who's going to take it over? Because what's happening to him is he's seeing these settlers coming into the Ottawa Valley, and they're cutting down the trees, they're damming the rivers because they want the beaver and so on, and of course they're ruining their hunting ground and fishing grounds, but there's not much he can do about it because they just don't have the weight of numbers. And it's the same for all of North America. In North America and the indigenous population right across the United States and Canada, the largest battle ever fought is with 4,000 indigenous. That's the biggest army they were ever able to get together. Why? Because they've been wiped out by European disease. And the Europeans then basically say, well, this is kind of strange. This place is wild. But of course, it's wild because the population of indigenous had been so decimated, places that had been cultivated had returned. There is more primeval forest in North America 100 years after Christopher Columbus because it's returned. Because the indigenous had used fire and other methods to clear out the forest so the buffalo could graze within those forests and they could hunt them. But because the population had been so decimated, the forests had returned. So when Europeans arrived in numbers then from the late 18th century onwards, they're saying, well, there's nobody really here. It's all uncultivated. Of course, it had been managed, highly managed. There had been no unmanaged territory within North America. But Christopher Columbus and the European diseases had wiped out basically 90% of the population. And that's why there's never really a huge resistance. And it's a different story in Ireland, which is interesting. So there is a trail now marked in around the Rideau Falls for Chief Pinacy, and that's his day is 1st of July. So again, not a well-known story, but a really critical story. At the same time, Ireland is colonized. Now, the big difference is, and this is a truism of Irish history, the Romans never came to Ireland. So in Ireland, you have this pre-Roman Gaelic society with landowning concepts very like the indigenous. They had a Brehon law. We had about 80 tuas in Ireland. A tua is both a land and a people. You couldn't separate the two. But we were never centralized. So when the Romans went into Spain, France, and Britain, they wiped out the culture as well as much of the population and centralized them around cities, London, Paris, and so on, and created highly centralized systems with roads, military barracks, markets, bureaucratic centers, even baths, and so on. And when the Romans finally withdraw from Britain after 500 years, they were there for almost 500 years, subsequent invaders would go into France and Rome and be able to seize the center and recreate the Roman Empire. So it's no surprise that the three great Western European empires, France, Britain, and Spain, were the most heavily Romanized. In a way, they're recreating the Roman Empire. In Ireland, it's very hard to conquer it because you can seize Dublin, but nobody really cared because Dublin was a Viking city. When the Normans come in, and the Normans are kind of what I would say the new Romans. They are Viking settlers. They go into France. They get Normandy as basically blackmail. Stop Viking raiders hitting Paris and you can have Normandy. They become, within one generation, they became the Knights of Europe, and they become very centralized. They adopt Christianity. They become bureaucratized. It's a documentary revolution, very organized militarily. But when they come to Ireland, there's no place to seize that will give them control. When William the Conqueror goes to England, he seizes London in 1066, because you seize London, you control Britain. But if you seize Dublin, nobody really cared. So you have two societies living side by side, the Norman and the Gaelic Irish. Real conquest happens with the Tudors, the very brutal war, and with the Cromwellian settlement and the Williamite settlement. So really nasty period from the second half of the 16th century on to the end of the 17th century. Huge wars in Ireland, massive casualties, burning, and of course expropriation of land, so that by 1653, basically the native Irish had been concentrated in the west of Ireland, and the rest, this is in terms of land ownership. So the Catholic Irish are not allowed to own land after 1690, and throughout the 1700s, they're barred from owning any land. It's only the Protestant conquerors that can own land, and they become the ascendancy. So when you go to Ireland and you see these beautiful big houses, and in Dublin, this is a Protestant elite running Ireland from essentially the 1690s onwards. If you're Catholic, you're poor, you can become a prosperous farmer, but emigration starts. from Ireland from the 1800s onwards. And if you're Catholic, there's obvious incentive. You can go to Canada, you can actually get land because you can't own land in Ireland. And so emigration begins out of Ireland. Now, emigration has also begun out of England and Scotland because the aristocracy is throwing people off the land. In Scotland, they're enclosing the land. So in a way, colonization begins at home. Now, so the first Irish, they're going to Newfoundland. Obviously Newfoundland is the most Irish place in Canada, but they're going for the fisheries. Again, because they're Catholic, they can't own land in Newfoundland because it's owned by the Protestants, and they're barred under the penal laws in Newfoundland from owning land. But they would come seasonally, and then they would settle and stay in Newfoundland. So that's the kind of the earliest. But the first known man that we know, the first known Irish person is Tygo Brennan. We know he came to Quebec in 1661 because he was registered to be married, but he's the first known Irishman in British North America. The Anglo-Irish who are running Ireland, very often they can't make money out of their estates, or they're not inheriting the estate. They have to develop a career in the British Empire. And that's what they do. They become great colonial soldiers, administrators. They're incredibly effective. You have Guy Carleton, one of the founding fathers of modern-day Canada, saved Canada twice, first from the French and then from the Americans. First Governor General of British North America. He's from Strabane. His brother is Thomas Carleton. He's the first Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick. In Nova Scotia, Richard Buckley comes in the Cornwallis expedition in 1749, stays there for 50 years. By the time he dies, he's known as the founding father of Nova Scotia. The Lieutenant Governor is another Dublin man, John Parr. Carleton, Buckley, Parr are actually sorting out the borders between the new provinces, for example. Richard Uniacke, Attorney General. The Carleton Hotel in Halifax was Richard Buckley's house, which he named in honour of Guy Carleton, his friend, when he visited, and that's today one of the earliest buildings in Halifax, and today the Carleton Hotel. Huge Irish colonial influence in Canada right from the beginning. And remember what northeastern North America looked like. This is all you have. You've just got Upper Canada and Lower Canada at the end of the 1790s. It's a really small. All of this Prince Rupert land is just, it's not colonized at all. And that remains true up until Confederation. The big thing to remember about the development of Canada is that there's a major struggle for global hegemony between Britain and France. This is going on for basically 150 years. And they fight it in the East Indies. They're fighting each other in the West Indies. They fight in North America. They fight at the Nile when Napoleon tries to get to Egypt via the Nile. It's a struggle for who's going to be top dog in the world. The French essentially leave Canada because they just kind of give up. They're not that interested in it anymore. And so they give up and they surrender British North America to the British, much to the chagrin of the Quebecois. But the two figures here are Napoleon and Arthur Wellesley, who is the Duke of Wellington. The Duke of Wellington is born in Trim in Westmeath in Ireland, born and raised in Ireland. His brother Richard, his older brother, conquered India between 1798 and 1803. He conquered more land than Napoleon and basically created the British Raj, which is the pillage of India is what gives Britain its wealth in the 19th century. But Duke of Wellington versus Napoleon becomes this titanic struggle, which is eventually resolved, of course, at the Battle of Waterloo, because the problem that Napoleon had and all the French had is that the Royal Navy is always beating them in sea battles. And they beat them in the Nile, they beat them at Trafalgar, and so Napoleon has to build his empire within continental Europe. He can't break out because of the successes of the Royal Navy. And he begins a continental blockade. In other words, the Royal Navy was getting all of their wood from the Baltic. That's where they were getting their wood from to build their ships. Now, John Caldwell, the father, Henry's the son. John Caldwell is a very famous officer in Quebec at the time. He's from Ireland, and when the wars are over and he's been very successful at the siege of Quebec, for example, in 1804, he says to the British Admiralty, he says, stop getting your wood from the Baltic, because Napoleon's going to cut it off. Start getting your wood from British North America. And the British Admiralty in 1804 agree, we'll get all our wood from Canada now, not the Baltic anymore. He calls up his nephew by marriage, William Hamilton. William Hamilton is born in Hamwood House in Dunboyne. That's the inside of it there. He comes to Quebec in about 1806. There's actually a moose head in Dunboyne in Ireland hanging in that house because it's a trophy back from Canada. So basically George Hamilton, because of this opportunity, he comes to Quebec. And what does he do? He goes up the Ottawa River because the Ottawa Valley has not been touched. Most of New Brunswick is worked out at this stage. So the British Royal Navy, through Caldwell and Hamilton, both two Irish guys, set up the lumber industry in Canada. And first prize to anybody who can tell me where he established himself. Where? Hawkesbury, very good. First prize. Hawkesbury, he sets up the Hawkesbury Mills. And he's a dominant figure in the Ottawa Valley throughout the from the time he arrives up into the 1820s, right into the 1830s. And the Hawkesbury Mills become absolutely huge. You can't see them anymore because the Caroline Dam has basically flooded them, but it was absolutely massive. And so you see the Hawkesbury Mills there, and his son John, there was also another son, Robert. At one point, George himself, very interesting life. I mean, he lost in a canoe accident on the Ottawa River, he lost 3 of his children in one go. He's a militia officer as well. He gets pneumonia in 1837 and dies, but the sons take it on. So you have to think about what's going on here. You've got Fulman Wright, who comes up from Vermont and sets up a farm at Hull in a log cabin they call the Wigwam. And he's the first guy that starts taking lumber out of the Ottawa Valley, and he floats it down in rafts that have to be taken apart at Hawkesbury to get past the rapids, assembles them again, and takes them down to Montreal to be sold, to make it partly into the emerging shipbuilding industry in Quebec, but mainly sent off to London. But because of the rapids, you're able to set up sawmills, and that's what he does at Hawkesbury. So for the guys who are further up the valley, you take you float your logs down there, you get them sawn into planks, bound, and then sent on. So they would basically intercept the traffic coming down from here. And I mean, the stuff that they're 700,000 feet of lumber in one day by 1,000 men. And this is one of the biggest industries in Canada at the time. And the two, John and Robert Hamilton, are one of the leading lumber barons of the period. But Hawkesbury Mill is absolutely critical to the whole economy of the Ottawa Valley. Charles Adamson Lowe, where Lowe got its name, he was another, he wasn't Irish, but he was very important because he was one of the few lumber barons who created the Gatineau privilege, which we'll talk about. So I actually went to, it's now the Le Chennai Cultural Centre. That's the building, the only stone building left, because when you went to Hawkesbury in its heyday, they had carpentry shop, a butcher, a bakery, a post office, dry goods. It was a self-contained village. Most of it's gone now. That's the office they had built in 1836. I think it's now the Chennai Cultural Centre. That's, of course, the Caroline Dam. And when I went back, this is actually Charles Hamilton. He is Charles Hamilton VII. Charles Hamilton I was the father of George Hamilton, who had built Hamwood House, and that's inside Hamwood House where the moose head is. Yeah. So it was nice to kind of meet up with him. He had a career in real estate in England. His father died. He took over the house, but the father had sold 150 acres. So he's trying to make the house still work, but it's a lovely connection with Hawkesbury. 1812 is really important because Napoleon is trying to break out of Europe by invading Russia, and he wants a quick deal in Russia, mainly so he can get hemp and stop the supply of hemp to the British Navy. But this is his breakout moment. So the empire, this is the climax of the struggle, is the War of 1812. The American ambassador actually goes with the Grande Armée on the campaign into Russia. So for British North America, this was a sign of what side they were on. I mean, he actually froze on the way home, and to death. But anyway, so when the Americans attack British North America in 1812, Wellington, who's chief of staff, I mean, he's the commander-in-chief of the British Army, he regards the War of 1812 as an absolute stab in the back. At this perilous moment, this absolutely perilous moment when the climax of a 150-year struggle with France, the Americans attack us in 1812. Now, of course, it all peters out, but Wellington comes to a conclusion that British North America is absolutely critical to the future of the British Empire. This is our bulwark. In tough times, we're going to rely on Canada when it comes to a struggle. And so he wants to fortify Canada against a future American invasion. And so what he does is, he says, okay, well, let's start fortifying. So he fortifies the citadel in Halifax, builds the Grenville Canal, fortifies the walls of Quebec. He builds Martello Towers. That Martello Tower is actually the one in Ireland, because they also built Martello Towers, which were designed to warn about a Napoleonic invasion. The citadel in Quebec is fortified. So Wellington really creates Fortress Canada. And for our purposes, he commissions the Rideau Canal. Because the Rideau Canal is not a commercial canal, it's a military canal. It is meant to relieve Montreal. If the Americans invade across the St. Lawrence River and besiege Montreal, he wanted to relieve it from his garrison in Kingston. So to get from Kingston to Montreal, he wanted to go via the Ottawa River. So you build a Rideau Canal to connect Kingston to the Ottawa River so troops can go. And of course, in building the Rideau Canal, the British Army sappers are involved in the most difficult parts of it. But very funny, it's a great story. In around 1807, there was a truce between the British and the French, and they both agreed to split a shipment of Spanish silver from Mexico. And the British Admiralty got half of this silver, 26 ships with Spanish silver. The Admiralty kept the money, and Wellington used the money to build the Rideau Canal. So Parliament only ever voted £5,000 for the Rideau Canal. And so when John Mackay, the guy who was constructing the Rideau Canal, he was paid in barrels of silver coin. And it was funny because I talked to a guy who worked at the embassy who's what do you call that thing when you, metal detector. He says, that's why I found Spanish reals down by the river. It was a really interesting story. So when Colonel By was subsequently kind of indicted by Parliament for overspending, it was really just a way of getting at Wellington, because Wellington had been a Tory, the Whig government wanted to get at him. But in fact, the British never paid much other than £5,000 for the Rideau Canal. The Rideau Canal was obviously to be used for commercial purposes, but the British Army had free movement on it and the other canals in the event that you needed to defend against an American incursion. So, but the point is, Wellington is an Irishman who fortifies America, commissions the Rideau Canal. Because of the Rideau Canal, there's Bytown, and then there's Ottawa, the capital of Canada. Would not have happened without Wellington's strategic kind of oversight. As a kind of caveat to this, when Joe Kennedy, who was ambassador in London in 1939, 1940, he was very pro-German, believed that the Germans were going to win. He teased he teased Churchill and said to Churchill, you know the Nazis are going to invade successfully England and hold your country. And Churchill said, he says, it doesn't matter. He says, we'll take the fleet and we'll fight them from Halifax. Which was kind of proving Wellington's kind of strategic insight that ultimately they were going to rely on. So that probably was what would have happened if the Germans had invaded England. He would have taken the fleet to Halifax and would have waited until the Americans eventually came into the war and fought back from Canada. So when you think about the lyrics of the Canadian national anthem, On Guard for Thee, all that kind of thing, Canada was the kind of guardian of the North for Britain. So that's the Rideau Canal with the Bytown Museum in one of the stone buildings that Colonel By built. There was another one across on the other side, and it's a great museum to visit. And of course, the Irish were involved. The Irish had been involved in the building of the Lachine Canal in Montreal, past the rapids there. When that job was finished, Mackay took them down to build the Rideau Canal. A lot of them died, but so did a lot of French builders, a lot of indigenous builders as well. Conditions were very rough. There was a lot of malaria. At least over 1,000 of them died. But when a big work camp started like that, you had to have your taverns. The amount that people drank in those days was absolutely incredible. Every single day they're drinking beer and rum and absolutely incredible. So Mother McGinty was actually a real woman, Sarah Ritchie. She fled Ireland because she had married a Protestant, and she became very famous for her tavern down in Bytown, and if you owed her money, it was up on a big chalkboard how much you owed, so eventually you had to pay the money. But she moved around a bit, but there's still Mother McGinty's bar there And again, she's just a good example of a woman who is trying to get some agency around her own life, earning some money in a tough business. So Mother McGinty was a character. The Celtic Cross of the Rideau Canal, I'm sure you know, that's commemorate everybody who died building the Rideau Canal. And we're not sure how many Irish actually died, but of course they did die. It wasn't that they were murdered or killed or anything. It was rough. It was rough, hard, difficult, very difficult work. And Colonel By was a very decent kind of overseer of the whole works. But we would go there every August to commemorate the Irish who died and the Rideau Canal. Now, when you hear Sparks and O'Connor Street, the main thoroughfare in Ottawa, they're both called after Irish people. So Nicholas Sparks comes from Wexford. He works with Philemon Wright, and he goes across the Ottawa River. The whole area of downtown Ottawa at the time was a farm owned by a guy called John Burroughs Honey. And Nicholas Sparks has made enough money with the old squire. He buys the farm for £95. And so the whole of downtown Ottawa is Nicholas Sparks. When Daniel O'Connor, he's been to America a couple of times, not very successfully, and he hears about the canal, he sees opportunities. And so Daniel O'Connor comes and joins him. And as Nicholas Sparks said, I became landlord to a town because he owned the farm, the town was developing. And of course, Daniel O'Connor then is also a businessman setting up businesses. So these are really two major figures in the creation of Bytown, because of course it's called after Colonel By, and he was a very beloved figure, but he left as soon as the canal was built. The real development of the town is by Sparks and O'Connor, and he was from Tipperary. And of course we don't see it now, but back in the day, at the turn of the last century, Sparks and O'Connor was an absolute thoroughfare. That's where all the shops were. That was where the life of the city was. First European families, you can see John Burroughs. And he called the boy was called John By Burroughs in honour of Colonel By. He's born in November 1826, dies a year later. But Daniel O'Connor's daughter is the first European born in Ottawa, Mary Ann O'Connor, and her grandson then was, well, her famous lineage, as it were, went under the name Friel. So they were the first two European children born back in the day, and both of them honouring Colonel By. Peter Robinson, just to bring him in, there was people may have heard about the Robinson migration. He basically was taking people from Ireland in sponsored migration to places like Perth, but also Carleton. And it was interesting when the first Irish arrived into Carleton Place in 1824, there was a very famous Ballygiblin riots, because the best land down in the Ottawa Valley had already been taken by the Protestants. And so when the Catholics arrived, these are Protestant Irish, a lot of them, because the first wave of Irish immigration is coming from Protestant farmers after 1800. They import the sectarian struggle from Ireland between Catholics and Protestants, which is why the early history of the Ottawa Valley is about fights and riots between the Irish Catholics and the Protestant Irish as well. So for St. Patrick's Day, when the Irish would celebrate St. Patrick's Day in Byward Market, the Protestant farmers would come in and stone them. And then they were marching around on the 12th of July celebrating the William of Orange. The Irish would leave Byward and go out to the countryside and start throwing stones at them. So this was going on quite a bit. John Egan is how many people have heard of John Egan? Good few people, yeah. John Egan is a really interesting character. He comes, he's uneducated, he's penniless, born in Galway, comes to Ottawa, becomes an incredibly successful man. He gets on with everybody. He becomes a successful lumber baron. A lumber baron in those days is really, you have to be pretty much a logistical genius, because it's a really tough business. Not only are you not certain about the price of your wood, but just simply the extraction of lumber in those days, working with men who are cutting down trees in the winter, sliding them down rivers, getting the rafts down to Montreal. I mean, incredibly difficult, managing shanty towns, and all of the problems that go with it. Anyway, John Egan, hugely charismatic figure, becomes one of the leading lumber barons of the area, huge in the development of Bytown itself. He's really promoting it. He's a politician. He's a very charismatic figure. I was at an unveiling of a stone bench because he was the founder of Aylmer. He built a stone house there. Eganville is called after him. He didn't want Eganville called after him. He said, no, no, don't do it. And his, you got to have a name called after yourself. So that's why it was called after him. A lovely man, very successful man, and a hugely important figure in the area. Peter Allen and the Shiners War, I should say, the Shiners War. So Peter Allen, he was certainly born of Irish parents. He may have been born in Liverpool. He's a total rascal. But he comes over, and after the Rideau Canal, when you think about it, the Rideau Canal is finished in 1830. They start the Rideau Canal in 1826. They finish the Rideau Canal in 1832. We have all these Irish guys settled. Some of them have got land because John Egan would sell you an acre of land for 50 cents if you were Irish. He was actually advertising in Cork, Wexford and Donegal for Irish people to come over, and he's bringing Irish people over. And if you're Irish, he'd give you the land. So he's clearing out, the Ottawa Valley of lumber as well as the Gatineau Valley, and when it's cleared out, the Irish are coming in here. They'd work in the lumber camps during the winter, and then in the spring they'd come up the Gatineau Valley here and they'd clear out the rocks and the tree stumps and physically make the farms with their own hands. So you have a lot of Irish here, but what are they going to do? So they're muscling in on the French-dominated lumber industry after 1832, which leads to huge fights, very, very violent period from 1832 to about 1837, 1838. I mean, they literally are running Ottawa, and there's murders, there's rapes. It's a very, very rough period. Bytown at this stage is known as one of the roughest towns in North America. And of course, the local police say it's nothing to do with us. The provincial police say it's nothing to do with us. The army says it's nothing to do with us. So I was thinking about the truckers, plus Change, who's actually responsible for law and order in Ottawa. But the funny thing about Peter Allen then is that as soon as this is kind of over, he retires across the river to Hull and becomes a very successful and respectable businessman. But it was a very violent period. Andrew Leamy, a much forgotten character. He's born in Tipperary, comes over. He works, first of all, he runs one of Peter Allen's rafts down to Montreal, so he's learning the trade. He then starts working for Philemon Wright, and eventually he marries Philemon Wright's daughter, who's already adopted by Nicholas Sparks. So it's a very close community. And Leamy is a very charismatic figure, physically very strong and imposing, and he buys about 160 hectares from Philemon Wright, the Columbia Farm, which becomes the Leamy Farm, and the lake is part of that, so that's why it becomes Lac Leamy. It's from Andrew Leamy from Tipperary. When he dies in 1868, originally they thought he died in a carriage accident, but 10 years later, 2 guys were charged with his robbery and murder. But again, he gave land for the Notre Dame Cemetery over in Hull, and one of the guys who managed his mill was J.R.R. Booth. So again, you can see this is a very small fraternity, as it were. And so you have people like the Gilmores, like the Hamiltons, like Charles Lowe, and including Leamy. They're taking advantage of the Gatineau privilege, which of course is this deal whereby the big lumber barons don't have to pay tax. Because George Hamilton, going back to George Hamilton, he's still active, don't forget, in the 1830s and 40s. He just didn't believe that small lumbermen should be involved in the business. It had to be a big business. It had to be stable because it was an uncertain business. So he's trying to crush people, small producers like Nicholas Sparks. He wants big business to take over the lumber industry, and that's where the Gatineau privilege comes from. So you've got, obviously, Irish settlement then is all over. I mean, literally, you can't throw a stone anywhere here without hitting the Irish. I mean, you've got Byward Market, basically all Irish, some French, but Brennan's Hill, Venosta here, Renfrew, and Douglas, of course. I mean, everywhere you go here, Almont, if you see the big woolen mills in Almont, they were set up by Irish-born brothers. I mean, it's everywhere. Almont was actually supposed to be called, I can't remember, it was either Wexford rather, or Wicklow, but they were told that the name was already taken. So they called Almont after a Mexican general because he was fighting the Americans, which kind of tells you something about the attitude. But anyway, so again, Brennan's Hill, Low, Martindale, Wakefield, Farrelton, which we drove up through here. I often say if you go to the graveyard in Farrelton, it's like an Irish phone book. I mean, it's all Irish. Little community, Brennan's Hill, close relationship with North Wakefield. Wakefield, of course, is kind of established by the English and the Irish, which is why it's a kind of a mix, but that's why it's still English speaking, even though it's in the heart here of Gatineau. So yeah, so a very tight community up here in Gatineau. The Battle of Brennan's Hill, of course. So the local Irish are up here, and they're not paying any tax because they're saying, well, if the lumber barons aren't paying any tax because they got the Gatineau privilege, why would we pay any tax? And they won't pay any tax. So the authorities in Ottawa say, well, no, you got to pay your tax. So they send they did send up some inspectors. They had boiling water thrown on them. One of them was locked in a basement for a day, and they all sent packing. So they sent the army up to put some manners on them. And but one of the municipal leaders up here basically said, okay, let's not get this out of hand. And so there was kind of a deal made. So there's a very famous song, folk song, up here where it basically said, we agreed to pay the taxes, but we said we'd do it on credit, and in Canada, nobody ever pays off their credit bill, so it was all kind of, honour was saved. But it was also said that the army left with fewer rifles than they came up with. They sold them off or gave them to the locals. So there's a famous Battle of Brennan's Hill. Martindale Pioneer Cemetery, Martindale Pioneer Cemetery. A really funny story. Elaine Gannon, this woman here, I was with her a couple of years ago. She went to get the names of the Irish in the graveyard in Martindale. Does everybody know this story? Yes. Yeah, and the priest basically bulldozed all of them into the ditch. And she was outraged, but she managed to get all the names. My predecessor, Jim Kelly, God rest him, he got them some funding from the department to put up the stones, and I visited there with her. And that, do we recognise? Yeah, and it was a great celebration of the recovery of ancestral memory. I still don't know why the priest was like that. I mean, I heard he had a drink problem, and but it was a very strange thing to do. Maybe we'll talk about it after when I've finished. St. Patrick's Day 2022, we were invited up to Douglas, and it was totally bleak. I mean, there was nothing stirring. Grey sky, nothing happening. I'm saying to Mary, why are we driving? Why do we agree to go to this? What's going on? And then I started to see leprechauns in the snow. Pulled into this barn, again, just total silence. And when I opened the door, there's 300 mad Irish people up in Douglas having the time of their lives. And it was just a brilliant party. And Terry and Kevin O'Gorman, people came in like the 1820s. Two of the oldest farmers up in Douglas. And I said to them, you guys got Irish accents. I said, yeah, everybody thinks we're Newfies. But they literally have Irish accents around Douglas. That's like, it's an hour and 40 minutes west of Ottawa. Huge Irish community. And they all know when they came in. They say, oh, yeah, we came in with the Robinson migration. We came in the 1820s. We came in the 1830s. One of them whispered to me, we came in with the famine, but we don't like to talk about it because it was kind of embarrassing for them. But it was amazing, the Preston Coles farm up there. And you can find that everywhere. Now, skipping back to Ireland. So you have Irish immigration coming to Canada from 16th century, really takes off after the American Revolutionary War. And it's Protestant after 1800, and it's really Catholic after 1815, because after 1815 in Ireland there's an agricultural depression because the war is over, demand slumps, and so you have that phase. Ireland is run directly by London from 1800 onwards. They've abolished the Protestant Parliament, and they're not doing a great job. Population is 8 million. Vast majority of the people are dependent on the potato blight. And during that period, think about this, 1 million people die of disease and starvation in Ireland out of 8 million. It's quite incredible. Another million leave almost immediately. And within 20 years, the population has dropped by half because it sets up a huge chain of immigration. So they basically, 1847 is a really bad year because the potato failure is everywhere. The British are also changing the public support scheme. They're winding that down. People panic. They get on the lumber ships, because don't forget, the lumber ships are bringing lumber from Canada to England and to Ireland for shipbuilding. They're going back empty. So before the Great Famine, people were coming to Canada. The Irish were coming to Canada because it was much cheaper to get a berth on a lumber ship than it was a ship to America. Because the American ships had certain standards because they were independent. The Brits had no standards. When they want to move the population out of Ireland, they packed them into what became the coffin ships and transported them across. I mean, on some of the ships, like the Virginius, of a passenger list of 420, 200 of them died on the sea voyage over. And that's a particularly bad one, but the casualty rate was pretty bad. They were packed in, they got typhus, which is a bacterial-borne disease on lice. And so there's an exodus out of Ireland. And you have 109,000 coming to Canada in 1847, across on these horrible ships. They're coming up, stopping at Grosse Ile if they have ship fever. If they don't have ship fever, they're allowed to go on to St. Lawrence, but up to St. Lawrence to Toronto. You think about Toronto, 38,000 people arrive in the summer of 1847 in a population of 20,000. That was the population of Toronto in 1847, 20,000. They had 38,000 diseased, starving and desperate Irish land on the shore. It's quite incredible. You have thousands arriving in Grosse Ile. The medical inspector, a guy called Douglas, committed suicide a few years later because of what he had seen. But the critical thing is, a lot of people think they came with the famine. The famine actually ends mass Irish migration to Canada, because if 100,000 come in 1847, by 1848 it drops by 90%, down to about 10,000. Everybody else in Ireland is going to the United States. And so the story of the Irish in Canada is lost in Ireland because everybody thinks it's all about the United States. But already the Irish settlement pattern has been established over the preceding 50 odd years. Now, it was interesting as well because this is MacDonald Gardens Park, which used to be, it was set up as a, Colonel By, when he was building the canal, created a graveyard at the bottom of Parliament Hill for the workers and anybody else who was dying in his work camp. And in 1845, they decided that they would close that and they moved to a new graveyard in what is today Sandy Hill. And they divided it into 4 sectors for the Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and the Catholic Irish got the swampy end of the graveyard, because that's how history always treats us. But anyway, that lasted until 1870, when they decommissioned it as a graveyard. And in the 1920s, they decided to bulldoze all the headstones. They took all the names. They bulldozed the headstones probably into that hill over there. But the bodies were moved to Beechwood Cemetery, right? And so we heard about the story because about 3,000 to 4,000 Irish came to Bytown, as it was then, in 1847. They were dying up on Parliament Hill. They were dying there were about 300 to 400 of them probably died. And Sister Bruyere was helping as many as she could. She was a nun from Montreal, the Grey Nuns. She did a great job helping to treat the Irish. There was no known cure for typhus in those days. The only thing you could do was cut people's clothes off them, wash them, shave them, put them in a good bed, and that would actually help because they were getting rid of the lice that were causing the disease. But I thought all the bodies had been moved until Michael McBain, a local historian, contacted me and said, actually, no, there's loads of bodies under MacDonald Gardens Park. In fact, he says there are probably 300 Irish, because when they were moved to Beechwood in 1870, you had to claim them and you had to pay for them. Because the Irish who died in 1847, most of them were families, and so they were never claimed. And so there's somewhere in there, there's a common grave. A common grave means they're all buried separately but in one place as opposed to a mass grave. So somewhere in MacDonald Gardens Park, there's 300 famine Irish victims from 1847 in there. And we did a ceremony then, August 22, at the site. James Maloney is the MP, chairman of the Parliamentary Friendship Group. We have Mark McGowan, who's a great historian of the Irish in Canada. We had representatives from Sister Bruyere, Pat Marshall, and that's Michael McBain. So a bit rainy, appropriately enough, but we had a great ceremony. These bronze shoes, this is a photograph from Ireland where there's a national heritage trail, the Famine Trail, and we're going to extend that Famine Trail around the world as the Global Irish Famine Way. And on the 1st of May this year, Ottawa City Council are going to vote to allow us to put one of those in MacDonald's Garden Park, which would be a nice memory. We've also got some funding to do ground penetrating radar in MacDonald Gardens Park to see can we find exactly where those 300 bodies are, because they were all buried probably in the same place with an open grave. They're all given an individual burial, which was nice, but somewhere in there they lie. Another story, the Collatin Estate in South Wicklow. Again, sponsored emigration from Ireland, because the landlords are trying to get the Irish off the land so they can switch to pasturage, which is more profitable. By the census of 1871, half of Smiths Falls was Irish born, and most of them are coming from the Collatin Estate. And there's now a program to try and find out where they've gone in Canada. So Tom was saying that he thinks that the 6,000 or 7,000 Irish who came to Canada gave rise to 400,000 descendants. I said not only did the Irish work hard, but clearly played hard, if that's what the outcome was. But anyway, that's a really interesting piece of history from Mother Barnes. Anybody hear of the Witch of Plum Hollow? Yeah. Very good. So this is our cottage restored on the road to Brockton. I was driving down to Brockton and with a young fella, and he says, "Oh, did you ever hear about Mother Barnes?" I said, "No." That was Mother Barnes. So she flees Ireland again. She was being forced to marry an older guy. She goes off with her lover, comes to America, comes to Canada, and has a bunch of kids. Her original husband dies. She marries again. He leaves her. She's kind of on her uppers. And so she's there kind of in the 1840s, 1850s. She charges 25 cents for a reading. So you go upstairs into this tiny little cottage and she will do a reading for you. Again, she's just a great example of a woman who creates her own economic agency to pay for her kids and some adopted kids who she took in. But of course, you know, towards the end of her life, she was interviewed and she says, I'm a bit of a fraud, really. She says, I'm not a fortune teller at all. Well, what she's doing is she's bringing all of her life experience to talk to unhappy lovers. If a farmer goes in and says, my cattle have disappeared, she puts the word out and finds out who stole them and give them back. You know, guy says, my wallet disappeared, and then he finds it in a tavern because she's put the word out, give him his friggin' wallet back. So she's kind of involved, she's using her wisdom and acumen and life experience to solve local problems. And of course, she's got a lot of problems because the Irish who are coming in from the Collatin estate are coming into this whole area around Brockton and Smith Falls, and they've got issues. How are we going to adjust to life here? How are we going, this is totally different, and there's tensions going on with all these people coming in. So she becomes Mother Barnes. Of course, Mother Barnes is closer to what she actually is. The Witch of Plum Hollow is just a journalist did an interview with her, then wrote a book, and it's The Witch of Plum Hollow. But in fact, it's Mother Barnes, a kind of a wise woman, but fantastic woman. She used to sit there in she was a tiny little woman, piercing blue eyes. She'd put the tea leaves in and start solving her problems, basically. But again, just a great example. She only ever charged 25 cents. And then a young politician went in and she became very famous. She was known all around this region. As far as upstate New York, they were coming in to talk to her. And a young politician went in and she said, you're going to be a great man. You're going to be the leader of Canada. And it was John A. Macdonald. But she told him this in like 1862, and everybody was talking about Confederation, so it wasn't a wild guess, to be honest. But she was a great woman. The Mount St. Patrick's, the well. People that know about the well in Mount St. Patrick's. Father McNulty comes over, sets up the parish. Poor old John McCormack arrives. See, the Holy Well in Ireland is actually a really ancient phenomena, and it goes back to pre-Christian times, where a well, of course, it gives life through its water, but all wells were known to be inhabited by the gods, and some wells would cure you of certain things. And then when Christianity comes into Ireland in the 6th century, it's taken over, and it becomes a Christian thing. And in Ireland, you can go to these certain wells will cure certain ailments, and you can go, they're decked out with Virgin Marys and crosses and photographed of loved ones and so on. So when Father McCormack came up, he says, oh my God, we don't have a holy well. What are we going to do? So he creates one. Why not? Only problem is I don't know what happened to him, but he actually drowned in the nearby creek a few years later. So, but you can still go see that. But it was a really good example of how people are importing the tradition. Such a strong Irish Catholic community, the priest said, we need a holy well. So he creates the holy well up in Renfrew. St. Bridget's Church, completed in 1892. Again, Byward Market, built by the Irish for the Irish. It's now a cultural centre. In the basement, there's a good cultural centre. We do a lot of gigs there as well. There's a nice bar if you haven't been. It serves a pretty good pint of Guinness. There's so many heritage orders. They've had a problem trying to clear out some of the benches to create a more workable space upstairs. But it's a really nice feature in Byward Market. Anybody hear of Tom Ahern? The great Tom Ahern. Tom Ahern was the man who brought electricity to Ottawa. In fact, he got electricity to the House of Parliament here before Washington did. He was a bit of a genius. He invented the electric oven. He did a banquet in one of the local hotels and only told people afterwards that their whole meal had been cooked by electric ovens. And of course, everybody's gone, oh my God, I'm going to die, it's going to poison me. How can you cook with electricity? But he was the son of an Irish-born blacksmith. John and Nora Ahern came in, And Tom read about the Edison's telephone and got a cigar box and wires and started making it. And himself and a guy called Soper set up a business, and he was putting in phones and doorbells and things like that. And eventually he does bring in electricity. He takes over the horse-drawn trams and turns them into electric trams, puts railways everywhere. He invents the electric heater for the trams. He drives the first electric car. He makes an electric car. And he builds railway tracks. So himself and his partner, they built a railway track out through Lansdowne. As soon as they built it, all the farmers became rich because they sold it as housing, because they had the railway. Never made that mistake again. Always bought the land first, then put in the railway, then the houses came in. Became a very wealthy man. He became an advisor to Mackenzie King, for example. His son, then Frankie, is a major figure in the foundation of professional ice hockey. He's a World War veteran, he's a senator. And his daughter then becomes Lilias. Lilias marries the son of the first Canadian Governor General. Anybody give me his name? Because I've forgotten it. What? Massey. Vincent Massey, thank you. She marries the son, but Vincent Massey is a widower, so she becomes his viceregal consort. And so when Queen Elizabeth II is getting the coronation, he sends her to London, and he, as the Governor General, stayed in Ottawa. So I make the point that in 3 generations, you have the Irish going from being an Irish-born blacksmith to representing Canada at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. She was a fantastic woman. And their house, actually, Frank's house is, if you know the entrance to Rideau Hall, the official Canadian government guest house was Frankie Ahern's house, where Lilias grew up. Great Irish influencers. Obviously, you've got Thomas D'Arcy McGee, hugely influential figure when it comes to the Confederation of Canada. He shapes the debate in many ways because he says we don't want to be Ireland and we don't want to be the US. We want a nice balance where democracy is devolved, everybody is treated with respect. Toronto, Mother Therese Dease comes over from Rathfarnham in Ireland in 1847, sets up a whole series of Loretto schools to teach young boys and girls. On and on it goes. Interesting, most people have forgotten. Hang on. Sorry, I'll come back to something there. Timothy Eaton from Ballymena sets up Eaton's department store. And I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember getting the Eaton's catalogue at Christmas. People remember that? He created this idea of the catalogue business because he realized that population was so spread across Canada, including Western Canada, so he would send out the Christmas catalogue that you could order. So he creates the mail order catalogue business, basically. He then has a Christmas parade in Toronto to encourage business in his department store, which is copied by Macy's with a Thanksgiving parade. So Eaton, brilliant businessman from Northern Ireland. J.R. Booth, the guy who was running Leamy's mill for him, he basically becomes a lumber baron as well. He buys some of the land up here. And at one stage, he's the richest man in Canada. Arguably, he's the richest man in the world at one stage because he is such a successful lumber baron. He's also the world's largest private railway owner because he's building railways to take his lumber everywhere. J.R. Booth is home in the Breton Flats. Again, son of Irish parents, and one of the serious lumber barons. I mean, I talked to Pat Marshall, who came here in the 1960s. She says even the 1960s and the 70s, she says the whole Ottawa River was bank to bank full of logs. It was covered in sawdust. The whole place was a lumber town. We forget that throughout the whole of the 19th century and into the first chunk of the 20th century, lumber was the engine of its economy. It was first the beaver, then it was lumber, then eventually grain. In fact, grain, everybody here, Richardson's, one of the biggest, it is the biggest privately owned company in Canada, began with basically grain merchants because the original guy was paid in grain and had to learn how to trade it, but he came from Auchnachoy in Northern Ireland today. Again, going back to this, the 3 Governor Generals in a row were Irish around before, during and after Confederation and helped settle down the relationship with London. You have Charles Monk, so he is there during Confederation 1867. He's a big pal of Thomas D'Arcy McGee. He's really encouraging Confederation. He wants Canada to have its own parliament. He comes to what is still Bytown and he buys the Mackay House and says, we'll make that Rideau Hall. John Young is Lord Liscar. He's the next guy in, and he says, don't execute the Louis Riel rebels. You'll create poisonous relations, and that actually works out for the first resistance. And then Frederick Temple Blackwood and Harriet Georgina Rowan Hamilton, Lord and Lady Dufferin. He comes here 1872 to 1878, 6 years here, hugely popular couple. When they move into Rideau Hall, he builds the ballroom, the tent room, the ice rink, the curling rink. They travel everywhere in Canada, hugely popular couple. His whole message to Canada is you're an amazing country, you're a great place, you've got to take pride. But of course, the subliminal message is stay part of the British Empire. Hugely, hugely popular figure from Clandeboye outside Belfast. So 3 critical figures, all of them Irish. When he gave a speech in Toronto as he was leaving, he said, my successor, is it going to be a great, great Governor General, except he's one congenital defect, he said. His congenital defect is he's not born in Ireland. And we make great administrators. But again, a kind of forgotten link. Colonisation, the Prairie Northwest. The Irish are part of the settlement program here. They regret, they sympathise with the Indigenous, they regret, but they say progress is progress. They're making careers. John Palliser surveys what becomes Alberta 3 years in a row. And the Palliser report basically opens up the Prairie Northwest settlement. Garnet Wolsey from Dublin leads a huge military expedition across Canada. Everybody thought he was going to fail, that he'd have to duck into American territory because you couldn't cross the shield. He manages to do it without losing a man because he takes on the first Louis Riel resistance. William F. Butler is his intelligence officer, and then Frederick Middleton is the guy sent to take on the second resistance by Louis Riel. But Garnet Wolsey's march across Canada proves that you could cross Canada without ducking into the United States, and it, again, opens it up to settlement and colonization. William F. Butler, who you saw, he published a very famous, what became a bestseller, The Great Lone Land, because he had been wandering around that whole area. His book, Red Cloud, The Solitary Sioux, is a fictionalization of the kind of the final Sioux leader. Was actually standard reading material in Ireland in the 1930s, interestingly enough. But it's still, I read it, it's a great, great read. It's a great adventure story. William F. Butler was a very fine writer, but he had served the British Empire in Sudan and Khartoum and in Africa, and had kind of learned his trade in Canada. He actually married Elizabeth Thompson. I don't know if anybody recognize these paintings. This is a very famous Scotland Forever. The Calling of the Roll in the Crimea War, it was a massive painting. And in those days when paintings were unveiled, it was like a movie premiere, but people were fainting in front of it because it was kind of so realistic. He then ends up getting Bancha House. He was from Tipperary. He got Bancha House as a house of favour where he lived to the end of his days. And last summer, this is the kind of thing I do on holidays. I go to graveyards. I found his grave in Ireland. John McCown from Ireland, and a manic collector of flora of the prairies. And his collection was so huge they had to build the Victoria Memorial Museum. He's the founding father of Canadian botany. But he, along with, he was a very, who was the other guy? There were two proselytizers for the expansion. It was McCown, will come back to me. McCown was one of those guys saying to John MacDonald, you've got to open up the Prairie Northwest to settlement. And it's so fertile and it's so brilliant. But of course, he never told them about the winters. So when the settlers went west, they had no idea what they were going to encounter. But again, a very influential Irish figure. George Arthur French. When John A. Macdonald said, well, we need some tough hombres to settle the Northwest, he modelled the Northwest Mounted Police on the Royal Irish Mounted Constabulary. And because Arthur French from Roscommon had served briefly in the Royal Irish Constabulary in Ireland, he made him the first commander. And he leads the very famous March West, which is the formative event in the Northwest Mounted Police, which of course becomes eventually the Mounties here. Nicholas Flood Davin, He's kind of a disappointed member of Parliament. John A. Macdonald gives him a job, says, solve the Indian problem for me. And so he goes down to Washington, has discussions there with officials and also with Indigenous people. He says the only future is for assimilation. And so he writes the report on industrial schools for Indians and half-breeds, Nicholas Flood Davin. He also, interestingly enough, wrote a book called The Irish Man in Canada. He was so proud of the fact that the Irish had made this contribution. He wrote this book because there are more Irish in Ontario than there are Scots, Germans, or English, or anybody else. But he did establish, now residential schools had always been in Canada, not always, but they had been there before, but they really take off after Confederation. Because it's only after Confederation that the Indigenous population is seen as a problem to be dealt with, which was why Don A. Macdonald put it in those terms, and Nicholas Flood Davin writes the report. He ends up, I think he's in Winnipeg at the end. He had really struggled with alcohol, so he tried to commit suicide with a gun that didn't work, so he went back to the gunsmith, got a proper gun that worked, went back to the hotel room, shot himself in the stomach, and took 3 days to die. So it didn't end well. But he was an Irish nationalist, and he was a suffragette, but he was a man of his time. They believed in progress, that progress was inevitable, that our progress was going to dominate the world. By 1914, the Irish, Catholic Irish as well, are very well established in Canada, and they join the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War, and this is when they really become Canadians. St. Bartholomew's, has anybody been to St. Bartholomew's Church? Yeah, so the window there was installed in 1919, one of the first war memorials. It's absolutely fantastic. It was done by an Irish stained glass artist called Philomena Geddes. It was commissioned by the Governor General at the time, the Duke of Connaught, one of Queen Victoria's sons. And it's the Archangel Michael welcoming the dead soldier to heaven. If you go there, it's a powerful, powerful narrative in that window. Probably the greatest example of Irish stained glass art in North America. Really, really worth seeing and finding out about that story. So it's in St. Bart's, which is opposite Rideau Hall. First war memorial, but an absolutely brilliant work of art. If you want to know more about the Irish in the First World War, Martin McGowan's book is out. He also wrote about the waning of the green when the Irish are becoming assimilated into Canada. Beechwood Cemetery, John Egan's grave is there. Moved obviously from Sandy Hill. The Ahern family plot is in Beechwood. There's great graves there. And that's Nicholas Flood Davin, and his face is regularly defaced with red paint, but that's his bust and final resting place in Beechwood. So Beechwood is really worth seeing. I don't know if people, well, if you like to go to graveyards like me and wander around, but it is actually quite beautiful. And of course, that's the Protestant graveyard, Notre Dame is the Catholic one. But Nick McCarthy does a great job there. More, I've covered, Ogle Gowan, the first Grand Master of the Orange Order. You know, but it goes on and on. Like when I walk to work, on one side I see Arthur Curry, your greatest hero in the First World War. His grandfather was a Corrigan from Ireland. His father changed the name to Curry to assimilate, not to look too Irish. If you see, there's 5 statues on the other side of the famous 5, the women who argued for women's entry into the Canadian Senate. 3 of them. 2 of them have Irish parents, and 1 of them has an Irish grandfather who's Ogle Gowan. So again, you can't go anywhere without seeing something and finding an Irish influence. And of course, a bunch of writers there too. So to sum up, and you can see it again in the history here, all around us here, from the Gatineau Valley, the Ottawa Valley, Hawkesbury, and so on. So you got early Irish, mainly Catholic immigration to Newfoundland and Quebec from the 1600s into the 1700s, going essentially to Newfoundland and Quebec. That's why to this day, 40% of Quebecers have some Irish ancestry. Think about that, 40%, because they're growing, the population is growing coterminously. You then have the Anglo-Irish. Don't really like the term, it's more Protestant Irish. Those are the kind of colonial administrators, guys out to create a business like George Hamilton. 1800 onwards to the 1820s, you're essentially Protestant farmers, mainly coming from Wexford and Wicklow, and they're coming in, they get the barrel land, of course. Then the Catholics are coming in from the 1820s. They're looking for they get jobs on the canals, and then in the lumber industry, and then of course they get farms. Soldiers as well. Wellington wanted to have what he called a warlike and loyal population settled in the St. Lawrence Valley. So soldiers, his soldiers, very many of them Irish, would settle in the St. Lawrence Valley so that when they were called up for duty as militia, in case the Americans invaded, they were ready for it. Michael McBain, the local historian, like his great-great-great-grandfather came in as a soldier of Wellington and settled in the Ottawa Valley. And you know, what we forget in Ireland is that throughout the 19th century, 30% of the British Army were Irish. 40% of the British Army in India was Irish. When Lord Dufferin went to become Viceroy in India, 8 out of the 9 Lieutenant Governors were Irish born in India. The Irish were very heavily involved in building the British Empire, but we try to forget that because it's not part of the official narrative. 70% of Wellington's army in the Peninsular War were Irish, you know. The 40% of the Irish on the Battle of Waterloo were in British uniforms and so on. So a lot of these are then coming over and he's settling them in the Ottawa Valley. And then after 1847, you still have essentially middle-class influencers coming in to help shape Canada, which goes on to this day because the Canadian flag was designed by a team led by Paddy Reid from Belfast. And Paddy Reid said Lester Pearson had a problem. He says he was getting into trouble with the Quebecers about what the flag would be. And Paddy Reid had fought with the Canadians in the Second World War, loved the Canadians, thought they were brilliant soldiers, loved them, moved to Canada, joined a PR firm, led for the Montreal Expo, which was the great coming out for Canada. And Lester Pearson said, I got a problem with the flag. So Paddy Reid had remembered the red maple leaf on the white sign on the shoulders of the Canadian soldiers. And he said, I want use that, 2 colours, something a child could draw, and the same on both sides. That was his instructions, and that's what you ended up with on today's Canadian flag. We're doing a project called 50 Irish Lives in Canada. We've got more than 50 now. We're trying to find a publisher, and these are some of the people. It's a 1,000-word profile, but we have, I don't know if we have her in the list yet, but the big problem we had actually was trying to get women. Because women are just anonymized or they're left out of the story. So we found Mother Barnes, so I wrote a profile of her, Mother Therese Dease, some of the Irish writers. Because the 50 Irish Lives, you have the conditions were twofold. One, you had to be born in Ireland, and 2, you had to be dead, just to solve any rows. So, but because I said if you start going into Irish-born Canadians, it's endless. It's absolutely endless. And I think the current figures for the Irish population of Canada is probably a big undercount, because a lot of the Irish would drop their Mac or their O to pretend to be Scottish, because you're trying to fit in with a Protestant Anglo-British royal society, as it were. And very often you do hear people say, oh God, I thought I was Scottish. And I discovered actually I'm Irish, you know. So I think it's a big undercount. And there are some of the people that we'll cover in our presentation. Thank you for your attention.
I will ask Gilbert now to do his presentation to Dr. McKee.
Well, before we close, certainly thank you for coming out this evening to listening to very inspirational, I think, presentation. Certainly got me going, a lot of reflection on this. Want to thank that all of this is coordinated by the Gatineau Valley Historical Society, the board, and all of its members. And we're always looking for new members, by the way, so if you want to sign up, please do. And this evening, I want to present the ambassador with a few things. First of all, volume 45 of Up to Gatineau, which has some interesting articles in it. And I know this evening there was a lot of mention of these lumber barons, the Hamiltons, the Booths, the Edwards also for us that came along. But our people for many years were taking the ash tree and making baskets and using them for all kinds of things. So I'd like to present the ambassador this evening with one of these baskets that is made with one of the artisans from our community, along with sweetgrass. And sweetgrass for us is very important. Sweetgrass, when we burn it and use it in ceremony, is intended to bring the good things towards you as you purify what's around you.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful. Yeah, that's beautiful. This will be immediately appropriated by my wife, just to let you know. I will not get to use this, but it's very beautiful. Thank you.
And of course, when we talk about the trees, indigenous people always very, much respected the trees, use it to build canoes, of course, use it also as a food product. And that was the maple syrup. So I'd like to present you with a bottle of our community Awasabi. It's produced in our community, has been now. We produce a lot of this. And it's historical for us because it was a food product that was saved and carried around, as a people that were clans and using all of the territory, being able to make it into butter, into liquid as a sugar and whatnot, played a very important role in our diet. And it has secret ingredients, we are told, that was keeping us healthy along with other foods.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow. I really enjoy sharing that. That's beautiful. Thank you.
So thank you very much, everyone. Have a safe
Well,
trip
wait.
back
No,
home.
we haven't come with one arm as long as the other, as we say in Ireland. We do have a gift. So this is some ceremonial tobacco, because I know that's very important in your culture. And I do like a moment with my own cigar sometimes, so I understand. We've got some nice Irish tea, which is a staple. We have some Irish chocolates. And then, bearing in mind our earlier conversation, I thought you might appreciate this book. And this book is called On Savage Shores. And the savage shores are Europe. And this book is about how Indigenous Americans discovered Europe and what they brought to Europe. And it's an incredible account. So don't forget, when we mentioned the potato famine, where did the potato come from? It came from here. And the potato was a revolution in Europe and Europeans' nutrient diet and so on. And the book is an awful lot more about the Indigenous contribution, because we always think the traffic went one way. It didn't. It went both ways, and we forget the influence that the discovery of America had on Europe itself. So I wanted to include that in the gift. And I also wanted to say that in 1847, you had the Irish disease-ridden coming off the boats. They're in Montreal, they're in fever sheds down here and down by the canal, but they're in Montreal, for example, and the Mohawks of Akwesasne saw them. They rounded up food and they gave it to them. And in fact, many of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe, Ottawa, the Mississaugas, they actually collected money. They had very little they could afford, but they collected money and they gave it for famine relief in Ireland. It's quite an incredible story. The Mississaugas of the Credit Nation, for example, were under an eviction order from their ceremonial territory, their territorial ancestral lands. They were on an eviction order. They didn't know where they were going to be sent to. They got money together and donated it for Irish famine relief. And it's quite an incredible story that's not well known. And tomorrow at the Irish Residence, we're planting 3 river birch trees. And we've invited guests along as a gratitude event to say thank you to the Indigenous for the support they gave us and they gave that support as part of their treaty obligations. The Dudum was on the agreement, because they said we have to help our brothers. And in extending the Irish Famine Way around the world as the Global Irish Famine Way, we're dedicating to all those who offer hope through compassion and success through opportunity to the stranger on your shore. And that dedication, I think, sums up exactly what the Indigenous did to every stranger on their shore. Whether it's the Europeans, whether it's the starving Irish, or whether it's, for example, the Chinese laborers in Vancouver, which to this day remember the Indigenous contribution to them. So tomorrow is a small event just to say thank you. We hope to make it an annual event to recognize human agency and human compassion to the Irish from the Indigenous, which we didn't get at home, but we got here. So just wanted to remember and remark on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have for Della as well, we've got you a copy of that book as well, and we've got you the tea and chocolates as well. So thank you so much for organising this and for everything that you do for local history. Thank you. So, if you're too shy to ask me a question here, I'm around. So.